Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, John. John, having been a resident with Dr. Spradlin, I know he had a subtle way of influencing people, sometimes in very unusual ways. So I understand how he might have said, I think you ought to go to Charleston. You know, this campus began long before the Health Science Center was established in 1960. And in the case of our keynote speaker today, the roots of his association with this enterprise began in 1958 when his father, William J. Maier, led the formation of the Maier Foundation to further higher education in West Virginia. That foundation contributed mightily to the establishment of the Charleston Division, and Mr. Maier, along with his colleague, Dr. John T. Chambers, who's in the audience today, and Dr. Chambers, would you please stand? Were the catalysts and planners of this building. Ed Maier has followed in his father's footsteps as a business leader in Charleston and as a generous supporter of WVU, the Charleston Division, and our partnered hospital, CAMC. Under his guidance, the Maier Foundation's generosity to WVU has never ceased. They provided funding for an enclosed walkway between the hospital next door and this building, prizes for students and residents at the annual research day, several $1 million to provide housing for students and residents, as you heard earlier, and $1 million to endow the Warren Point Chair of Medicine. And just this past March, they pledged another $1 million to establish the William J. Maier Jr. Chair of Research here in Charleston, which was matched by funding from the Research Trust Foundation of West Virginia. In one stroke, Ed, you have created the largest endowment to ever advance biomedical research here in the Canal Valley. And again, we thank you. So it's with truly great personal pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mr. Edward Maier.
Chancellor Kalenda, Dean Hansbarger, I appreciate very much the opportunity to address your convocation today. Certainly congratulations are in order for West Virginia University on the 50th anniversary of the Health Sciences Center. As the Dean told you, there's going to be a larger convocation tomorrow in Morgantown where the President of the Institute of Medicine will address the gathering. It's an honor and a pleasure to be asked to speak here this morning. Since I'm not a doctor, I can't talk about medicine or diseases. Since I'm not an educator, I can't talk too much about medical education. Since I'm not a hospital administrator, I can't talk about management of hospitals. But I do have some years of experience, some may say old, and part of what I'm going to say has to do with history. It's going to be difficult to follow Dr. Litton's account, which were so eloquent and so humorous. Mine won't be as much, but I have other reasons for going back and talking about the history of this institution here in Charleston in any event, which is what I'm familiar with. I'll try not to talk about myself too much or about our foundation, but I'll just say that our foundation board members are very proud of the fact that we played a very critical role, particularly in the earlier years. Actually, while our primary mission is focused on higher education and for the education of West Virginia students in higher education elsewhere, over 1/3 of our total philanthropic giving has gone to improve the quality of life for the Charleston Division of the West Virginia University Medical Center, its students, residents, and interns. What I would like to talk about the most, however, if I want to talk about history, is the one man who has never received the recognition that should be given him. And it made me feel so good to see him walk down that hallway as probably the last person that sat down before the festivities started today. In the embryonic stages of the formation of CAMC and the Charleston Division, I can assure you that we wouldn't be here in this building today. There might not have even been any celebration here in Charleston if it weren't for this man. So in thinking about the history of what happened, I wanted to re-educate myself and try to remember almost 40 years ago. So I reread the salient chapters of my father's autobiography, The Education of a Philanthropist, together with the pertinent chapters of The Birth of a Medical Center, which was published during Phil Goodwin's reign as president of CAMC. So if my story piques your interest, I would recommend each to your earnest consideration. The first chapter of Phil's book deals with CAMC today and about the, quote, Maier role. That's very kind, of course, but I submit to you that really it should be, quote, the Chamber's role. Yes, Dr. John T. Jack Chambers, whom the Chancellor introduced, is the principal protagonist, the basic reason we are all here today in this building. Without his foresight, leadership, and undying assiduity, who knows what would have happened to medical education in the entire state of West Virginia. Here in the Charleston area in southern West Virginia, we need to look back only 40 years. And I was fortunate enough to be around, just having graduated from college and spending 2 years under the tutelage of my father and our several family businesses. 40 years ago, if you can think back that far, as has been said before, we had only one medical school. Perhaps we should return to those thrilling days of yesteryear, as the spokesman for the Lone Ranger said, huh? There were no teaching hospitals in West Virginia except there in Morgantown. And there was no such thing as CAMC. At the time, Jack Chambers was a highly respected OB/GYN physician, practicing, but he was also an entrepreneur and a businessman who understood the challenges we had here in West Virginia and knew a lot of what was needed to improve the quality of life for everyone, particularly in the medical field in West Virginia. Now, it just so happened that one of Jack's brothers, Tom, was a tax attorney with Jackson Kelly, who had been representing Dad in such matters, so Jack asked Tom to introduce them. At the first meeting, it was very obvious to Dad that something needed to be done because of the most compelling fact in Jack's argument, and that was what Dean Hansbarger said before, maybe others. The average age of the physician in West Virginia was over 56, maybe close to 60. That's pretty dramatic. How could this be? We were educating 60 to 80 medical students every year at Morgantown. The problem was there weren't any teaching hospitals except in Morgantown, so most of the kids had to go out of the state. They'd go to Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Charlottesville, Lexington, Columbus, wherever. And as is true still today, 75% of those students would stay in the area where they did their intern residency programs. So Jack pondered the problem and thought it might be possible in the Charleston area to have now this was anathema to most people at the time, hospital consolidation. There were 7 at the time, believe it or not, 7 independent hospitals in Charleston. None of them really large enough to be a teaching hospital. However, each thought it had to deliver babies, right, Jack? So each tried, and it was a loss leader for each of them. And a few years earlier, Jack had had some success in consolidating some of the OB departments in those hospitals. And he began talking to some of the key board members of the 2 principal hospitals to see if they might be willing to consider such consolidation. He knew that it was necessary, and that is the first leg of what I like to think of as a 3-legged stool. We had to have a hospital large enough to be a teaching hospital, so we had to have the merger of the hospitals, right? That was the first leg. The second leg had 2 parts, but it was really the easiest part because it had to deal with money only. Jack knew about our foundation through Tom as well and thought there might be funding available. It was certainly a novel approach to our foundation at the time because we hadn't considered medical education. We'd been funding need-based scholarships at the various colleges and universities in the state. So we were trying to determine the extent of our capabilities and of devising on ways to try to expand on our limited resources. It soon became apparent that it was going to take $6 million to build a Charleston division of the West Virginia University Medical Center. We didn't have that capacity. So we started thinking the state ought to participate in that. So Jack got us an entree to meet with the governor in his mansion for lunch And we held out a carrot, as Dad always called it, of a challenge, $2 million if you put up $4 million. That would make $6 million. Governor Moore immediately took to the idea and supported our every overture to the Board of Regents, which eventually came up with a match. So with this leg of the stool looking like a reality, Jack was able to begin serious discussions with the key members of the two principal hospitals, Charleston Memorial and Charleston General, who had just recently merged with McMillan, Marmette, and Mountain State. Then, about that time, a serendipitous meeting took place, which began probably the most important third leg of the school. The Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, one John Dunlop, came through Charleston one day to thank Dad on behalf of Harvard for the generous donations to his college from our foundation. When he asked Dad what future plans he was making for the foundation, he told him of the dilemma facing the medical education in West Virginia. Dean Dunlop replied, "Well, I know something about that. I did the economics on the report of the Special Commission of the Carnegie Foundation on medical education and the nation's health. I am currently President Nixon's Medical Education Committee. I serve on that committee." So after we read the report, we learned that as far as West Virginia was concerned, the Charleston area was recommended to be a center for medical education. Shortly thereafter, Jack and Dad and I flew to Boston, to Cambridge, to witness Harvard's methodology for medical education, and then we went to Morgantown and visited with Dr. Harlow, the president of West Virginia University, to see if we could convince him and his medical school to support, here's the important third leg, the affiliation agreement with West Virginia University and a Charleston division if it were to be formed. To shorten the long story, the medical school dean at WVU was against the idea. He was replaced immediately by someone. Is this the truth, Jack? He was replaced by someone who understood the benefits of what we were trying to accomplish. Deans can be replaced, Clark, huh? Shortly after, all three agreements came into being. Dean Dunlop had Charleston designated as an area health education center, AHEC so-called, to pay faculty and other expenses for several years while this building was being built and put into operation. I say Dean Dunlop, for those of you who don't know, he is the namesake for Dunlop Hall, which is right across the street here. But it all came together because Jack Chambers leveraged each of the three legs. He made us promise not to give the money unless it was matched by the state, unless the hospitals were merged, and unless there was a formal binding affiliation agreement between the university and the new hospital, CAMC. What a genius. Jack Chambers pulled off the greatest deal in public-private funding, egos from what were at least 7 hospital boards, and bright, forward-thinking educators to produce, 40 years later, this magnificent teaching and learning medical education complex and first-class hospital that we have here today. The economic impact, particularly on southern West Virginia, is incalculable. The creation of the intellectual capital staggers the imagination. As I said before, Jack has never received the recognition, the proper acknowledgement, or the credit for the most important role that he played in getting us where we are today. I would suggest, whenever you see him, go up, congratulate him, and thank him. Let him know how you feel. Now, those of you who know Jack know that he's a very self-effacing gentleman. He shuns the limelight, believe me. But he was an early champion and mentor and almost second father of mine. Let's give it up again for Jack Chambers. Everybody sit down. Jack, stand down. Everybody sit down. Your name right here. Good morning.